contaminated sediment remediation in the Detroit River, Western Lake Erie Basin, a current status, case studies, and advice. This program on contaminated sediment remediation was funded by the Great Lakes National Program Office of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, grant number GL 975-45601. Additional multimedia materials and the entire contaminated sediment study are available at www.tellusnews.com/AHR/EPA and with the companion CD-ROM. This program documents and disseminates the conclusions of evaluating ecosystem results of sediment remediation undertaken by Wayne State University and the Greater Detroit American Heritage River Initiative. To easily access program content and make the information more usable, this program is divided into 4 separate tapes, comprising a program overview and 3 categorical chapters. Program Chapter 1 contains a brief overview of the program format and key to material contained in the 3 main program chapters. Lastly, it has some key remarks and excerpts from the total program. Program 2 contains an overview of the contaminated sediment problems in the Detroit River and Western Lake Erie areas. It will help bring individuals up to date on the 10 current projects. Program Chapter 3 focuses on 2 case studies, the completed Newburgh Lake Remediation and Restoration Project and the underway Connor Creek Remediation. Program Chapter 4 contains additional considerations and advice for people wanting to undertake sediment remediation projects. Dr. Russell G. Christ, Jr., Station Director and Branch Chief at Grosse Ile, aquatic research biologist involved with contaminated sediment studies in the Detroit River, Saginaw River, Buffalo River, Grand Calumet River, and Lower Fox River. He has been working on the Great Lakes for 30 years.
The situation in the Detroit River with sediments are not unlike many in the entire Great Lakes as well as across the country. Sediments and contaminated sediments are a major issue nationally, but also impacts us here in the Great Lakes system. For example, the 41 areas of concern around the Great Lakes, out of those 41, 40 of those have contaminated sediments. So many of the local remedial action planning groups, many of the local advocacy groups, many of the groups that are trying to move forward in their area of concern or in their water body are faced with these same issues. Generally, these situations revolve around the decisions of have the sources reduced to the point where we can make this decision. Will this community be able to, along with federal, state, and other partners, be able to pay for this type of remediation? And what is the benefit of that remediation? Is this just going to be a local remediation, or is there going to be a demonstrable long-term improvement, for example, in fish concentrations or reductions in toxic chemicals? The main thing is trying to determine whether you can successfully remediate sediments based on whether or not those sediments will become recontaminated after that sediment remediation. One of the big things that have been lacking in the Great Lakes and nationally also is a post-monitoring program after the sediment remediation has taken place. The Detroit River is one of the great rivers of the country and one of the gateways of the upper Great Lakes to the lower Great Lakes in the St. Lawrence Great Lakes system. The Detroit River itself is about 30 miles long and drains an area of about 160,000 square kilometers. The flow is about 180,000 cubic feet per second. It takes about 24 hours for a buoy to go the entire length of the river. The river itself, as I said, drains along a large drainage area. The Detroit River has been the cornerstone of the economy and of the population of the Detroit area for well over a century. There has been European usage of the system for over 300 years. The Detroit River has a large drainage area, about 160,000 square kilometers. It has influences then of a large area in the state of Michigan, in Canada, and then from the north. Many of us have had an opportunity to propose that we study the Detroit River as part of a larger ecosystem, or take an ecosystem perspective, the Huron-Erie corridor, which then would include the St. Clair River, Lake St. Clair, the Detroit River, and Lake Erie with all of its drainages. So there is a large picture to be examined here, and the factor is that these influences all have an impact on what's happening in the Detroit River today. The different drainage areas are, for example, the Clinton River into Lake St. Clair. We are the only river in the Great Lakes with an area concern that feeds into another area of concern, and that is the Rouge River feeding into the Detroit River. In general, the Detroit River has made major improvements in water quality, in terms of its biota, in terms of its quality of habitat these many years. In the problems in the 1960s and 70s were very visible. The problems that face us in the present, in the year 2000 plus, are much more invisible. What happens in the Detroit River is affected by a number of items in the other portions of this lower basin. For example, what happens in the St. Clair River, in Lake St. Clair, the Detroit River, and all of its drainage has an impact as well on the western basin of Lake Erie and the central basin of Lake Erie. In general, all these things together make us have to look at a watershed approach, and we've proposed that the Huron-Erie corridor is an ecosystem study management unit, that these influences are so great that many times we are going to have to look at the entire ecosystem for an answer, working in watersheds to make sure that we're improving some of the major water bodies. In the case of the Detroit River, documentable improvements have been made over the past 30 years. Those improvements have to do with fish, wildlife, water quality, and habitat. Those improvements are unmistakable, and we have shown major declines in contaminants such as PCBs, mercury, dioxins, as well as other heavy metals, for example, like copper. In the case of making decisions about remediation, we have to take this watershed approach, and we have to then move into an area of very difficult decisions. The improvements have been made, but in the past decade, those improvements have somewhat leveled out. They're not as evident as in the past 30 years. And so the decisions facing us are very time-consuming, they're technical, and they're very costly. The numerous effects of point sources, non-point sources, things such as combined sewer overflows, the inflow of the St. Clair River into Lake St. Clair and then into the Detroit River, all the activities in the watershed such as the Rouge River, Mungwagon Creek, these different tributaries, the E-course, will all add up to a sustainable development, but it may take a long period of time. So making decisions about the Detroit River will have to take into account all of the different sources, all of the different watersheds, and all of the different influences that are occurring still today on the Detroit River, given we've made tremendous improvements with the water quality and the environment in the Detroit River. The situation is that sediments are one of the remaining reservoirs of contaminants in the Detroit River. We can demonstrate toxicity, we can demonstrate contaminant concentrations, we can demonstrate other effects. These contaminants may move into the food chain and affect or have an influence on, for example, fish consumption advisories. In the case of making a decision on sediments, it is very difficult because it is a multimedia issue about assessing whether the loads from the rivers, the tributaries, the watersheds are being reduced, and being reduced to a quantifiable point that then we can move to saying that when we make a sediment remediation, we will make a sustainable improvement. That is to say that when we make a decision about sediment remediation, it's sustainable for 50 or 100 years, and that situation then, we've restored that situation that we're going to have a clean environment. But all these factors have to be assessed in making that right decision. We have to establish priorities. We have to determine which sites should be removed first. We should establish whether or not that will be good enough for that site, whether that site will be recontaminated in the future based on all the influences from the watersheds and water flowing into the Detroit River. And we have to determine what are the methods for doing this. So in the case of the Detroit River, we have made some of these attempts at determining which are the priorities and what will it look like. Generally, in every case that we examine in the Detroit River for sediment remediation, there will be a local improvement. What we get will be better than what we have now. Then the question is this the correct thing to do for the Detroit River ecosystem? Is this the biggest impact that we can have, the biggest bang for the buck in many cases, because these are costly decisions? And then finally, the question about sustainability. When we finally determine which sites are the high priority, high impact, with high probability of sustainability, we then face the different modes of remediating the sediment. We can look at a number of different things, but the primary method for sediment restoration is removal, and it's typically by dredging. Sometimes there are local impacts from dredging. They're temporal in nature, possibly some water column toxicity, possibly some downstream effects from the dredging, but generally this is the primary method. We also then fall into other situations, such as, should we solidify this material, turn it into glass or bricks? Should we incinerate this material? Should we put this in a confined disposal facility? These are these large containment areas where dredge material are usually placed in navigation dredging. Or should we put this material into an appropriate landfill, dependent upon regulations? These are some of the factors that we have to address, and most of these are very costly. One of the areas that people are concerned about is transportation of this material wherever it may end up would be the final repository. Generally, some community members may be afraid of a spill or that type of thing in their community on the roadways. One of the other issues facing us in the Detroit River is that when the dredging procedure occurs, much of the time there's a lot of water in the material that's taken out of the river. One of the recommendations may be that we place that material on land so it dewaters and dries before transportation. It may be unsightly, it may smell, and there may be some associated risks to possibly children, possibly birds and other wildlife, squirrels, etc. So this is one of the things we face on a day-to-day basis when we're trying to make this decision. These decisions and these actions are all extremely costly, and that's why we have to know what our priorities are these improvements sustainable, and what methods should we use to complete our goals to make the improvement in the Detroit River. In making these decisions across the country and in the Great Lakes about sediment remediation, we have to establish our priorities in terms of what are the beneficial use impairments that we have to satisfy the most quickly. In doing so, we have to look at the improvements in the system, which calls for monitoring data. And many times the monitoring data are hard to find. When we look at the monitoring data and we're showing improvements in water quality, reductions in point source loading, and reductions in contaminants in sediment, then we may be ready to make decisions about recovery, restoration, sediment removal. One has to look at the monitoring data to make the decision as to whether or not these reductions have occurred, so you have improvements in these media to then make improvements in sediment. And then the sediment process with the types of removal, the priorities, take over from that point.
Roseanne Ellison has been with the EPA for 16 years, 10 years as an on-scene coordinator for emergency response and lead project manager for over 30 Superfund cleanups.
Sediment remediation, contaminated sediments, is a problem in the Detroit River. And cleaning up those sediments is a very complicated task. It involves trying to target areas that are contaminated, that are causing problems, and then figuring out the extent of that contamination, and then trying to address that in an environment that's constantly moving because the water's going by. Some people have compared it to sediment cleanup to trying to dig soil with a backhoe in a tornado because the environment's constantly moving around it. So it's a very delicate and complex operation. Sites in the Detroit River have been previously identified through a number of sediment surveys. And it seems that some of the biggest problems, the areas that are drawing attention to cleanups, are areas that have problems with maybe high mercury levels or oil and grease, called polyaromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs. Seem to be the predominant problem, and of course polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. Anyway, some of these sites have been identified in the Detroit River, and these sites affect the rest of the environment. They can affect obviously the local environment and the organisms that live in and around it. They can affect the food chain from uptake from the organisms that do live around these areas, and then are preyed upon by the other higher levels in the food chain. And also they can cause problems in fish. One of the things that we found in the Detroit River is incidents of tumors in fish that have been identified with contaminated sediments. But the problems are the actually cleaning up the contaminated sediments is a very difficult is an involved operation, and typically involves dredging the sediments. And there's different ways to do that, and around the Great Lakes it's been done many different ways. The kind of dredging that's used, either what's called hydraulic dredging, which is a kind of like a vacuum. Another way to do a sediment cleanup is to use clamshell dredging, which is just a normal bucket that picks the sediments up. But there's other considerations to cleaning up the sediments during the operation. Usually the contaminated sediments are going to be, a little bit of them are going to be suspended in water, and to try to minimize sediments migrating during the cleanup, which will happen a little bit in every cleanup. There's other things to take into consideration on how to minimize that, and it just depends on where the cleanup's happening to what you need to do. Some techniques have used silk curtains, which silk curtains will hold back the sediment, and there's a number of other things, but one of the considerations is to make sure that the sediments aren't migrating while doing the cleanup because the water's passing by. And in some cases oil's a problem, that we might be going after trying to clean up oil or maybe mercury in the sediments, but there's a lot of oil down in the sediments in the Detroit River over the many years that it's been used because it's an industrial river, and so those considerations have to be taken into account at the beginning as well. And the whole operation of handling the sediments once it's up is another process. And right now down in Connors Creek, or up in Connors Creek, there's they're using an innovative process where they dewater the sediments in bags, and the bags are almost like filters. And that's it's a new process that hasn't been used on the Detroit River. So right now they're assessing to see how that works. And then as far as what to do with the sediments, again, there's a whole realm of things that can be done with them once they're up, just depending on how contaminated they are. But there is a project that's going to be occurring for the Black Lagoon, the sediments in the Black Lagoon, and called an innovative technology to recycle the sediments and use them in a cement type of, dry them out and use them for cement, so that there's some beneficial use to them once they're cleaned up. So it's sediments. There are some positive things that can be done, but it's not an easy process. Very involved and can be highly expensive. Sometimes I get asked what from citizens or individuals what I can do concerning contaminated sediments, because it is a complex problem and it's not anything that people normally have access to. Because of just by the nature of the fact that they're at the bottom of the river. But there are a lot of things that people can do, and one of the major things is to just be aware of the situation and why the sediments are a problem, or where those problems are, and let people know if you want something done. That means the local officials or someone that's in a position to be able to take into consideration those problems, either evaluate them or do something about them. But the important thing is that people are aware of what's going on, and or what they're aware and educated about their concerns, and vocal enough to draw people's attention to it. Because in a lot of cases, I know with my experience in the EPA, that there are a lot of problems out there that would have not come to our attention if it wasn't for local people expressing their concerns about it. Monitoring of typically when a sediment cleanup is completed, there is a process called confirmation sampling or monitoring to make sure that the area that you just completed cleaning up meets a standard that you set out at the very beginning. So on a site-by-site basis, there is monitoring for contaminated sediments, and often there may be monitoring during the actual remediation for what may be levels of contaminants, or even just the amount of sediments are going downstream during the actual operation, because you're going to get some loss because it's in a water environment. So that's about the limit of monitoring at this point in time, is for confirmation sampling for cleanup. There has been some discussion about long-term monitoring. The sediments are an integral part of the whole ecosystem, and when we're looking at the overall health of the Detroit River, long-term monitoring of sediments is probably, when we're looking in the future, going to be important for us to be able to quantify or be able to verify what kind of positive results were accomplished by cleaning up the sediment, so we can see a before and after picture.
U.S. Coast Guard, this is an Uncle Cameron phone, over.
Shift colors underway, 1 prolonged, 3 short. Runners very well. Pat, you got my starboard quarter. Yep. Wheels, you got my starboard quarter. I got your quarter. You're doing great.
30 feet to the pier, starboard quarter. Closing or opening?
Captain's on the bridge. Captain, good afternoon, sir. All personnel. And the land, all stations. The propulsion test is satisfactory. On the bridge, CXO out of the deck and the con.
Right, Joe, right here.
Right standard rudder.
Right standard rudder. Our rudder's right 20 degrees. This is the bridge.
Much better, this is a more for left, over. Slack at a 2 and hold. Roger, 4 for left, over.
Shift to rudder left full.
Left full line.
Roger.
Rudder's left 30 degrees.
Can you on 7-1 over?
Yeah, you should be short ties in the bow board, sir. Brows short. And short ties.
Thanks for fan tail, Con. Folks at Fantail Bridge. Bell Island, Bell Island. This is Grumpy, over. Fantail Bridge.